So I am here in Laura Koonsberg's normal seat. So Laura Koonsberg is obviously not here. It looks like you're in a containment vessel somewhere. Where are you?
I am in the glorious BBC studios in Salford, just next to the fine, fine city of Manchester.
Because the Conservatives are going to Manchester.
They are. They are. And so we were always planning to be here this weekend to bring our programme on Sunday mornings to our viewers from the venue of the Tory party conference, as is tradition and convention, and speak to the party leader, which we will be doing this morning. However, for all the wrong reasons to coming to Manchester this weekend has proven to be as an opportunity to go and see and speak to some of the people in the community who've been caught up in a terrible attack on Thursday morning. So we'll be talking about the Conservatives' hopes and dreams and fears for the next few days, but also the ongoing aftermath of the terrible attack on the synagogue in Manchester.
All on Saturday's Newscast. Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And it's Laura in the studio in Salford.
So as you've rightly reminded us, there are two rivers meeting. One, a terror attack on British Jews. The other, the annual conference of the Conservatives, the first for the leader Kemi Badenoch. So it seems to me that you've been bringing these issues together because, is it right, you've met Kemi Badenoch at a synagogue?
Yes, so we went this morning to the synagogue where the attack took place at 9:31 on Thursday morning. Kemi Badenoch made the trip herself to go to the synagogue to meet the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, there, and also to speak to some of the police officers who were on duty today, and some of those also who were part of the effort to help on Thursday morning after the attack unfolded. And while we were there, we spoke to Kemi Badenoch. She talked about how appalled she was at the attack, but she also had quite a strong criticism of the government, I think, Paddy, and I do want to talk about speaking to some of the people in that community in a second, but I think that she has this afternoon sort of upped the political pressure on the government in terms, not of course of their role in anything to do with this individual who was killed by the police to prevent more bloodshed, but in terms of the government, as she would say, being responsible for allowing a climate to develop in this country in the last couple of years. And she told me that Keir Starmer and Labour had been responsible and not done nearly enough to tackle what she described as homegrown terror, those ideologies, extremist ideologies that she believes have taken hold in some communities in this country and that are creating a real climate of fear for some British Jews. This is how she explained it.
I think that the government could have been stronger. I think that over the last few years, a lot more should have been said and done. We cannot tackle this with nice words and, asking everybody to come together, faith in togetherness. It's nice to say those things, but words are not enough. We need action. We have seen protests since October 7th itself happen in London and all around our country, a lot of them being used as a cover for intimidating Jews. Not enough has been done to shut them down. The fact that we had a protest on Yom Kippur after a terrorist incident that killed Jewish people, I think was extraordinary. The way that we're applying our laws is too feeble. But the Prime Minister himself needs to show that he can come out as strongly against the people who do this sort of thing as he does against others. I don't think that is happening enough. I want to see a lot more tough action from the Prime Minister and a lot more words that will show Jewish people that they are safe in this country, because what worries me now is that quite a lot of them are leaving.
I mean, there's been a very strong conversation in the newspapers and online and on the airwaves about whether or not the government went too far to prescribe Palestine action. And the then Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, took to the newspapers to say there's information you don't know about, oh, member of the British public, that led us to take this decision. So although we've heard the leader of the opposition say the government hasn't gone far enough, Laura, both you and I have read newscasters who feel, and viewers to your programme and listeners to mine, who feel actually the government's taken a misstep. And so there really is a reminder there for me of the perilous place we're in the British conversation, where there is polarisation around all the key issues, and now a political line being drawn when it could have been an opportunity for unity of the political classes.
It's just an incredibly fraught situation, whichever direction you look in. And as we're chatting, I'm looking then at pictures on the screen in the studio where I'm sitting, which have just flashed up pictures of people being arrested at the protest in London for being in support of Palestine Action, which is a prescribed terror group, which means that supporting them and showing support for them is illegal. There was a protest here also in Manchester of people wanting to show their support for Palestinians, but a counter-protest turned up as well to object to people protesting. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary both went public yesterday and said, please do not, as a mark of respect to the Jewish community this weekend, please do not go and exercise your right to protest on these issues. And then the Prime Minister himself this morning was firmly and roundly criticised by some Jews who were attending synagogue that he went to with his wife Victoria this morning. And that comes the day after the Deputy Prime Minister was heckled by people outside the synagogue where the attack was on Thursday, shouting, "Shame on you." So everywhere you look, this conversation is incredibly fraught and hot and difficult. And the sort of politics of terror, if you want to call it that, are sort of terrifying also for politicians, because everywhere they look, there is danger and risk. I think it's also, of course, important to say that in the Jewish community, like any other community in this country, nobody thinks the same. So while there were some people incredibly upset, heckling the Deputy Prime Minister in the street yesterday when he attended a vigil, there were also two rabbis that I spoke to today at a different synagogue in a different part of Manchester, and we'll play some of that conversation on the programme tomorrow. But they did not share that level of anger and vitriol almost towards the government. So certainly they had very strong concerns about rising levels of anti-Semitism, but they did not hold that kind of attitude of and bear that real anger towards government for, in their view, you know, that accusation that they hadn't done nearly enough. So this is just about as fraught and tangled as it gets. And you sort of think, Paddy, it's one of those political situations where it's very easy to say, you mustn't allow people to do that. But then what's about this? Oh, and it's completely unacceptable to do that. Oh, but then what about this? And then, of course, you talk to people who are right in it as part of their lives. And I'm aware I've now been talking for a very, very long time. But I spoke to 3 little boys this morning who had turned up to see what was happening at the synagogue. 3 little Jewish boys, 8, 12 and 14. And they were telling me about how it's perfectly normal at their school, not just that they have security, but one of them said to me, every day someone comes into school and something else has happened. They might have been shouted at in the street, or had something thrown at them in the street, or something sprayed at them in the street. And for these 3 little boys growing up in the UK, that's their norm.
Yes, and I mean, it's right to speak and give airtime to those voices who you've met this morning. That's the point. That's why I think we were hoping you would expound on how you'd spent the morning in Manchester, and we'll go on to talk about the conference in more detail. For my part, I've been speaking to people in Gaza. We've been calling them today about this trap of hope and fear. And also I've been speaking to the family of British Israeli hostages who were held or have been held in Gaza. People do want to know what kind of message the political class have for this moment in time, both what's happening on our streets in the United Kingdom and what is happening in the destroyed streets and in the destroyed hearts of people in the Middle East. So with that in mind, we have these protests and this conference beginning just as we have the biggest momentum for some kind of stop coming from the White House, who is now amazingly in dialogue with Hamas.
Yeah, and while it seems, and our colleagues in the Middle East have been reporting very clearly that there are still many obstacles here, it's also very clear, and a senior figure in the British government indicated this to me too, that this is the best chance yet. and that the stars do seem to be aligning at least to make some end to the bloodshed appear much more likely than it has up until this point. So we will see.
Can we say that the political temperature will go down if the war is paused? Can we say that?
I think that's a likely outcome. I think never say never. I mean, but I think that is a likely outcome if you remove a situation that is so upsetting, so aggravating for anyone looking in on it. If you remove that, then you might expect that the political temperature would come down. And certainly people I spoke to this morning all said explicitly that the levels of anti-Semitism, that day-to-day experience for Jews in this country, has become much more difficult and much more fraught since the conflict in Gaza began. Now, can we therefore conclude that automatically, if there's a solution and the fighting ends and the killing ends, that definitively that will cool temperatures in the UK? I mean, I think we can say that's likely. I don't think we can say that's automatic. But I think we can say that's likely because it was many people would say it was the cause of things becoming worse and more difficult and more fraught. And certainly people said to me this morning that was their experience. I mean, there was one man I spoke to, one father I spoke to, who told me that his grandfather had come to the UK having survived Auschwitz. He had always been proud that Britain was the place that gave his family a home. And he said, you know what, I'm not political. He said, I look at what's happening in Gaza, I think it's terrible, but I'm not political. And I don't see this as being anything to do with me. I'm paraphrasing, we didn't record this conversation. But he said that what people had been shouting at him in the street in the last couple of years was Free Palestine as a result of what has been happening in the war in Gaza. And he was not baffled or bewildered, but I think frustrated, thinking this is nothing to do with me. I too, as a human being, look at that situation and deplore what is happening.
Yeah, because I mean, I have this in my own experience. So if you take Sharon Lifshitz, who I'm speaking to again on BH tomorrow, and who you've spoken to, her father Oded, who was murdered as a hostage in Gaza just 3 weeks after he was taken, he all his life fought for a free Palestinian state. So he was living in a kibbutz. He was a peacenik. He drove Palestinians to hospitals in Israel in happier times. He was taken hostage. He wanted himself a free Palestine. He was taken hostage. So the reason why the gentleman you've met, whose family fled the Holocaust, is surprised is because he did not expect the actions of the Israeli state, which are disputed within Israel itself by fierce opponents, to be directed at him on the streets in Britain. And normally what would happen is the political class would coalesce to say, he's right. He should not have shouts on the street. And that's why I'm intrigued that there could be a political fault line between the big parties about how to respond right now and what message to give to us as citizens sharing the same pavements.
I think that's exactly right. And what do they do? The right to protest. If we think about the protest, for example, the right to protest is a fundamental right of this country, right? That is absolutely. Think of Speaker's Corner in years gone by in Hyde Park, or, it's a fundamental right. No politician is ever going to say you're not allowed to protest in the UK. And yet here we are in this position where it is a subject of political debate. What are people allowed to write on placards? Which particular groups are they allowed to say that they advocate for? Is there a case to say, actually, on some days of the year, you should be allowed to ban a march or allowed to ban a protest? While at the same time, all our politicians would say, well, of course, free speech is a good thing. That's a fundamental British value. But the world that we live in is so complex that many of these values are really being tested. I think it's fair to say that without wanting to have a very pompous philosophical debate on a Saturday afternoon when you might be, wanting to watch the football or have a cup of tea.
Well, if anyone has had a pompous philosophical debate, it's this weekend newscast. So we're on good. But let's bring this section to a close, if you like, by saying there have been some fabulous episodes getting to grips with what happened in Manchester, hosted by Adam in the week. And we are bringing you the flavour of what's happened with Laura's interviews this morning in Manchester about the synagogue attack. And now we are, as promised, going to move on to talk about the simple, old-fashioned business of a party conference, albeit set against tumultuous times. So let us get to grips with that. She's new at conference as the leader, even though it's 11 months, I think, now.
That's right. And I think Kemi Badenoch's newness is seen as lots of people as something that she has not exploited. So there are lots and lots of problems with the Conservative Party. Newscasters know this. They're way, way, way behind in the polls. They're very unhappy. They're very disgruntled. Kemi Badenoch doesn't really seem to have been able to catch a break. And one of the interesting analyses that was put to me, to use another pompous word, how unlike me, was that because we're now 11 months in, she's sort of stuck in this place where she's no longer really new. And she didn't grab that opportunity to make a first impression. But she's also not been there long enough to have much public recognition. Yes. Much authority.
Because she said, didn't she, as she took the job, hang on, I want to listen. I want to go around. I want to groove the groove. I don't think she said that. I think that's me. But she said...
You're always grooving the groove,
she was, but what she was saying was, I'm in listen mode. We're obviously going to relaunch. But I think the launch date she set was 2030, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the tag of her leadership campaign, which now I was joking with a Conservative yesterday because, you know, when I was trying to pick their brains about things and they were bemoaning the fact that basically, in their view, she's taken far too long to come up with anything. I did sort of gently tease them and say, well, actually, it did say 2030. You know, she's done what it said on the on the tin.
Yeah, I mean, and because the thing is, the drubbing was so severe, wasn't it? They ran out of prime ministers. The voters told them in no uncertain terms to get out of office. That happened. It's so contrasting to the fact that they appear to be saying the same in polls to Labour. But on the other hand, when she took over, that was the atmosphere that we were reporting at the time. She had to be humble in the face of the poll of what had happened.
It was, but there are lots of people in the Tory party who would tell you that character-wise, she is not a humble person. And that she decided that the best thing to do was to basically stay quiet for some time, try and sort the party out, try and make sure that money was still coming in from donors, and then at some point come up with a whole load of policy. Now, we are going to see lots and lots of policy this week.
Right.
However, I think it's really worth noting there's a fair body of opinion in the Tory party that essentially agrees that she fudged her chance to make a first impression, and you don't ever get that back. And while she was hanging back, Nigel Farage was stepping in to that vacuum.
Right.
And, you know, if you never quite get it, you don't quite put your hand up quick enough, because politics is so fast. If you've got a rival on the right of politics, obviously discuss actually some of Reform stuff is not particularly right-wing, but broadly speaking, let's say if you've got a rival on the right, the Tories don't have the luxury of time. And that, I think, is the debate that is really going on in the background in the Tory party.
Right.
Is, do they have enough time to give her a chance to sort it out? Or actually, is the conclusion really that it's already gone? So
in the short time that remains, there are sort of 3 Ps, aren't there? There's policies, there's personalities, and there's process. Newscasters hate it when we just do personalities and process. So let's promise to do policies. But just, is it really true that there is a threat to her leadership from supporters of Robert Jenrick, or is that a flyer?
I think it's not true right now at this very moment in time. Is it a threat that exists? Yes, absolutely. Is it a threat that is definitely going to come to pass before Christmas? Not necessarily. But is there a very likely, very real threat to her leadership after what they expect to be a drubbing at the elections in May? Yes, 100%. And the only person at this moment in time who looks like, to quote one source of mine, he wants to rip up the grass is Robert Jenrick. But no, I mean, I was told very clearly, and maybe they would say this, wouldn't they? But I was told very clearly by his camp that there is no truth in this suggestion that they are trying to overtly organise at the moment.
Right.
And I think, and it'll be interesting to see, I suspect that he might try to do a reverse Burnham, like basically not be spotted that much at a conference deliberately, rather than me having a huge profile before. You know, he could have, for example, done a few newspaper interviews or something in the run-up to conference. Actually, he's not been out there making headlines deliberately.
Right.
So that's quite interesting.
A reverse Burnham. It's 2025 lingo that we all suddenly now understand. But and he was seen as going too early, wasn't he? So Jenrick might be saying, I must go late. So this conference I read in your online piece is all about her, says one source.
Yes.
But we rule out a weekend Jenrick-style challenge. So we're going to just scamper through the issues.
We'll never rule it out, Paddy. Don't say that.
But this weekend, I'm ruling it out this weekend. But
well, it's fine if we're wrong. We're always happy to be wrong.
Well,
if we're
you will
wrong.
be. Me will be wrong because you said don't rule it out. So I'm ruling it out. But what do I know? So what I do know is that at 10 o'clock last night they put out a new policy.
Yes.
So and let's turn to some policies which that they would leave the ECHR.
Yes.
Now, do we need to say that that's surprising, or because the Prime Minister has spoken about tinkering with the ECHR?
It is entirely unsurprising that Kemi Badenoch is finally going to say out loud what everybody in her party has been expecting her to end up saying, that the Conservatives would leave the European Convention on Human Rights if they win the next election. It's entirely unsurprising that she's saying it now. It's still undesirable to the vestiges of the rump of the softy bit of the Tory party, who think, why would you want the UK to be like Belarus and Russia?
I want Softy Bit as a podcast.
Softy bit, softcast. That could be about ice cream, or it could be about all sorts of things. Let's not go there.
Right.
So that's unsurprising. Here's the question. Given that Reform have been saying this for months and months and months and months and months.
Yeah.
Is it going to get them any traction? So there is I know I'm a terrible political nerd rather than thinking about the policy, but here's the question. Is it actually going to get them anywhere by saying this now? Debate. Is it going to shift a single bit of the polls? Probably not. You're right to say, and the government actually is involved in talks on this with other European countries, the government is looking at tweaking how it's applied, how the courts actually use the ECHR. Important also to say for newscasters that, frankly, the government has been saying that for a long time. I think Yvette Cooper even said that to us in opposition,
right,
that she would look at some of it.
The big picture is, do you need to tack to the centre as Kemi Badenoch's Conservative Party, or do you need to do what Keir Starmer's doing, which is tackle reform? And it seems to me that there is an open question. No one can decide. You need more events to see, you need more policies. And whether you're not going to go heart and soul for the centre ground, which is kind of what Tony Blair put as
and David Cameron and George Osborne and kind of Theresa May and sort of Boris Johnson in his own way. But then you had Brexit. I was going to say breakfast. Then you had Brexit coming in to surprise that bit. But I think this is the point. The Tory party still hasn't really resolved that.
Right.
So Kemi Badenoch is someone, look at her other policies. She says she'd scrap the Climate Change Act. Okay, well, that's definitely reformy tending, righty tending, rather than the sort of Amber Rudd, David Cameron, Green Conservatives. I still remember the conference where he appeared in front of a large tree and the whole thing looked like the Teletubbies with a sort of green and pleasant land and all this kind of stuff. We're not in that mode at all. But this is what somebody else said to me. Look, if I want a full fat Coke, I'll have a full fat Coke. In other words, why would you go for the Tories if they're sort of a slightly softer version of Reform, or what they would say is a much more serious version of a party on the right, because they don't see Reform as a serious party. But if immigration is your top issue, this source was suggesting to me, you'd go for Reform, you wouldn't go for the Tories. So the gap in the market that some Conservatives identify is in the centre and the right, kind of where the Lib Dems are. It's not where Reform are. And this is a debate. I think fundamentally, the Tory party hasn't resolved this debate. Kemi Badenoch's team believe that she will be able to resolve it this week, that she will stamp her authority. She will say, this is what it means to be an authentic Conservative. Come with me. We will turn it around. But there's a huge question mark about whether she'll be able to pull it off. And we don't know. Conferences can be... When we were talking last week, right, about Keir Starmer, would he have a terrible week or a decent week? Would he be able to do a good speech or not? Actually, for Keir Starmer, he did have a pretty decent week. Not an easy week, but he certainly settled the nerves, probably temporarily, frankly. but he did do some nerve settling because his speech was one of the better speeches that he has given. His performance in various interviews and millions that he did was a bit more punchy than it has been for some time. Of course, it's perfectly possible that Kemi Badenoch will... I said Kemi Blinder. Kemi Blinder will play a Badenoch. It's perfectly possible that Kemi Badenoch will play a blinder this week, but she'll surprise people if she does, right?
Well, what they have in common is the ism. Though people said, what's the Starmer-ism? And they say, what's the Badenochism? And with his back against the wall, at his leader's speech, he found a bit more ism, said his friends. Do you know what the ism is in Badenochism?
I think it is, what she will try and say is a modern conservatism. So not the softy stuff. I think we'll hear from her things like, we've had enough of foreign courts telling us who we can deport. We've had enough of greenies telling us that we have to put extra cash on energy bills to pay for wind turbines. We've had enough of government telling us what we can do and how to run a business. So I think that is the line that we'll sort of hear.
So that takes us to some issues like drill, baby, drill, doesn't it? Because,
I mean,
there's an issue that all of our listeners in the oil and gas industry would really understand a big fight about whether we should give new licenses for new exploration versus allowing continuing sites to be continually explored, which is a different sort of license. And I think there's also policy gap emerging there, isn't there?
I think that's absolutely right. There is, because, Labour came into government saying, everyone will have clean energy by 2035. It'll all always be marvellous. Now they are sort of say, we have to kind of keep oil and gas for a while and it'll still be part of the mix for a long time. And oh dear, let's not make lots of people in Aberdeen particularly incredibly unhappy by going too fast. It's talking about a fair transition or a just transition to green energies. But Kemi Badenoch is really trying to insert the Tories into this debate by saying she'd get rid of the Climate Change Act, getting rid of the net zero target of net zero in the UK by 2050. That's made Theresa May very, very unhappy because she brought that in as Prime Minister. And, Kemi Badenoch did vote for it at the time. So she's trying to put herself into that position.
That is an ism. I think there am I saying in a cynical way, where's the ism?
Well, I think there is an ism.
That is an ism, isn't it?
Well, I think she would say modern conservatism. So not your Cameroonianism.
Yeah.
Not Mayism. I think when you talk to her and her people and people who back her, I think what they say is, look, she is trying to carve out a sort of conservatism for the 2020s that is culturally conservative. Don't forget, one of the reasons people respect her in the conservative movement and beyond is because she spoke out in favour of single-sex spaces for women when that was politically quite a lonely thing to do. She talked about some cultures being less valid than others, which is now, since she first said it, I think that's the kind of language that more politicians might be comfortable using. So she was admired for this sort of plain speaking. So maybe a sort of plain speaking, light touch, authentic conservatism. I think we will hear the word authentic conservatism. Of course, to most newscasters and most normal, ordinary people, unlike a sado like me, authentic conservatism, what does that mean? Does that mean it really is an antique Chesterfield? What is that? What does that mean? However, you can see that they are trying to develop a brand and an ideology. And I don't mean that cynically. Genuinely here is a sort of body of thinking, an identity for the party now. But the questions about her political ability to pull it off, the questions about whether they've left it far too late because she decided deliberately to stand back and work through her plans properly, those are going to hang over this conference very, very heavily indeed.
Okay.
And I'm not just being a mean old hack to say it's very common. In conservative circles, you hear people talking very, very freely about the fact, not the fact, the conjecture that Kemi Badenoch may well not be the Tory leader by the time they gather again for their conference next year. And beyond that, a senior Tory was saying to me this morning, it's perfectly possible to imagine a scenario where the party kind of falls over and then doesn't really exist anymore.
But then you did also say that this is a moment and she could grasp the moment, and that's why we are going to be covering the conference. You'll be interviewing Kemi Badenoch. A couple of quick details. One, November the 2nd is important in a leadership vote this side of the new year, I understand. And then there's a karaoke story with which we need to go out. Otherwise, the editor will sack us, because the karaoke story is one of Tim Shipman's many scoops.
So for those people who've never been lucky enough to come to a political party conference, karaoke is one of the fine traditions of one of the companies that comes regularly to conferences and plays host to lots of the exciting social events around the conference fringe. And on the last night of party conference, they put on a karaoke party at which all sorts of grisly performances and events take place, at which I was once accused of having danced with Michael Gove, which was a total fabrication, and then ended up, however, in Her Majesty's Press, which was totally untrue. And I was never stupid enough to sing at a karaoke party at any of these kinds of events, although I know many people who did.
I was wondering if you were going to say Her Majesty's Prisons then, but if the singing was that bad.
Oh, no, that was at the end of the party.
Right. So she said, when asked, that her track would not be Gloria Gaynor, I Will Survive, because she has more self-confidence. And it's a great scoop from Tim Shipman, although I always thought I Will Survive is about self-confidence. But then what would I know? It's a long time ago now, Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive.
Well, it is, but it's a great song, isn't
Yes.
it? It's a cracking song. I mean, I see what Tim was trying to do there. He was trying to get a line to say, get her to say, yes, I'll survive, and then he'd have a headline, thanks very much, but didn't quite go there. It reminds me of when we took the weekend, do you remember we talked to Paul McCartney, and we had Rachel Reeves and Kemi Badenoch on at the beginning of the programme, and I asked them both what their favourite Beatles song was.
Yes. I mean, you say we, it was you who spoke.
It was me, sorry, yeah, it was me. And then Rachel Reeves said, oh, actually, I'm a Beyonce fan. I'm not really into the Beatles, but then did name one, I think. Or I think she said, Hey Jude. And then Kemi Badenoch did this big dramatic pause and just said, Yellow Submarine. Which then lots of people went, oh, but that's a Ringo Starr song or George Harrison song. Sorry, it was George Harrison wrote it, wasn't it? But then lots of people got in touch and said, well, Macca didn't even write that one. So I wasn't that surprised that she didn't come forward with a karaoke fave. But maybe we should ask her again tomorrow.
Well, it's all down to what happens on the live TV sofa with you. I think we've got...
And in the radio studio with you.
Yes.
What are you doing tomorrow?
Well, as I said, we will speak to British-Israeli hostage family member Sharon Lifshitz. Also joining us is Lord Kinnock to reflect on current Labour woes, and we'll talk about reinventing George Smiley in the new era.
Are the mellifluous Welsh tones of Lord Kinnock.
Yes, and who have you got besides the Conservative Party leader?
We will be joined, back to our first story that we were discussing, we'll be joined here in Manchester by the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. So Shabana Mahmood and Kemi Badenoch both with us tomorrow.
Please join Laura or join me by all the electronic means you prefer. And we'll see you here or hope you'll see us and join us here for Newscast on Sunday tomorrow. Thanks very much and goodbye.
Thanks very much. Although that just has made me wonder, I wonder if there are any newscasters who actually watch the telly and listen to you at the same time. Be quite a weird experiment. They could have your voice, which, let's face it, is much nicer, easier on the ear than mine is. And then me wanging on the telly with the sound down. Or maybe vice versa.
And the other option, which we haven't discussed, is
staying in bed?
Turning them both off. So look, we're definitely at the end, Laura. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.